Well, one of the greatest heroes of the church's social justice wing is the great St. Peter Claver, known as the slave of the slaves. So Peter Claver, born in the 17th century in Barcelona, joins the Society of Jesus as a young man. And he's known from those earliest days as someone of tremendous intelligence and piety. Prompted by what he took to be the direct call of the Holy Spirit, he volunteered to serve the poor in what was then known as New Spain, so in the New World. So off he goes to Cartagena. And in Cartagena, he begins to minister to the slaves who are coming off these dreadful slave ships from Africa. And it's here that he really distinguished himself in his Christian ministry. So he and his friends would go and meet these ships, and they would minister to the slaves as they came off. And there's an extraordinary letter that Peter Claver wrote to one of his Jesuit superiors in which he describes the work they did. And he describes these people who came off usually stark naked, starving, disoriented, many of them too sick even to stand, many dying. What he would do is he'd bring fruit and water to them. Often he'd build a crude shelter, often out of his own clothes. There's a wonderful detail in the letter. He says that for those who were dying, he would light a fire and then throw aromatic spices on the fire so that the dying might have a pleasant experience as they approach death. So extraordinary, beautiful outreach to take care of the physical needs of these people who are very much the poorest of the poor. I don't know anyone today who would gainsay any of that or wouldn't deeply appreciate what he was doing and would see him quite rightly as a 17th century Mother Teresa figure. But here's what I find really interesting as you continue to peruse that letter he wrote to his superiors. He describes that what he did after he took care of the immediate physical needs of the slaves was a work of evangelization. He began to teach the rudiments of the Christian faith to those who were coming off these slave ships, sometimes using sign language because they didn't share a common language. After the rudiments, let me read a little bit from the letter. Here's what he says. We went on to more extensive instruction, namely about the one God who rewards and punishes. We asked them to make an act of contrition, and finally, we declared to them the mysteries of the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Passion. So this is happening as the people are coming off the slave ships. Just after he's cared for their immediate physical needs, he very passionately and concretely evangelizes. Now, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't recommend that that's the best moment to evangelize, to evangelize quite so quickly as Peter Claver did. However, what I find really interesting is Peter Claver did not drive a wedge between two things that people today often do, namely between this concrete care for people's needs, the social justice sort of ministry, and the ministry of evangelization. He clearly saw them as very much of a piece. He kept together something which has been kept together at its best within the great Catholic tradition. He thereby resisted what I call a sort of Kantian reductionism, which is much on display in our culture and even in parts of the church today. What I mean is the reduction of religion to ethics, and to put it in our contemporary language, largely to the work of social justice. How often do you hear some version today of this? Look, it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you're a good person. Doctrines and dogmas, we often fight about those things, and that's a lot of intellectualism. What really matters is that you care concretely for the poor. Now, I've referred to it by its name, Kantian reductionism, because of Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century German philosopher, who opined exactly that in his writings on religion. He said that all of religion, liturgy and sacraments and prayer and doctrine and dogma, all of it finally is reducible to ethics, to doing the right thing. And see, I think he's been massively influential on people today, especially the young. What matters is what Peter Claver did when they first came off the slave ships. But see, I want you to see he did both these things. He, yes, indeed, engaged in what we call works of love and mercy and social justice, and almost immediately, he evangelized. In fact, I think it's fair to say he saw both of those as tremendous acts of mercy. Keep something in mind. It's a statement of Pope Benedict that I always found extraordinarily clarifying. Pope said, the church does three things, essentially, in its life. The church worships God, the church cares for the poor, and the church evangelizes. So think of all the ministries, all the activities of the church. They fall under one of those three headings. And Papa Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, said, reductionisms of all kind ought to be resisted. You shouldn't say, it all really comes down to evangelization. No. It all comes down to the liturgy. No. Nor should we say, it all comes down to care for the poor. No. All three are essential to the life of the church, and each one calls upon the other two. And let me just close by referencing our present Pope. No one would ever think of accusing Pope Francis of being indifferent to social justice, indifferent to the care of the poor. I mean, it's been one of the leitmotifs of his papacy. However, I think it's way too often overlooked that Pope Francis talks about not just the economic and political peripheries, but what he calls the existential peripheries. Those who are marginalized because of their lack of faith, because they've not been sufficiently catechized or evangelized. Those who've lost contact with God. They're the poor as well. They're the ones who have to come to the field hospital of the church. Pope Francis does not drive a wedge between social justice and evangelization. And there he stands very much in line with his great Jesuit predecessor, St. Peter Claver. And so I would say yes to social justice, yes to evangelizing, down with Kantian reductionism.